Something extraordinary is happening right now in the heart of Europe, and most people have absolutely no idea. There is a piece of Russian territory, completely surrounded by NATO countries, slowly being strangled from every single direction. No tanks have crossed any border, no missiles have been fired, no war has been formally declared. And yet, the most militarized exclave on the entire European continent is being suffocated in a way that military textbooks have never quite described before. The name of that place is Kaliningrad, and what NATO has done to it in the past 12 months is nothing short of brutal. Here is what you need to understand first. Kaliningrad is not connected to Russia. It sits on the Baltic Sea, wedged between Poland to the south and Lithuania to the north, completely cut off from the Russian mainland. It was once a great German city called Nigsburg, one of Europe's most celebrated intellectual and cultural centers. After World War II, the Soviet Union seized it, expelled the German population, and turned it into one of the most heavily armed military outposts in the world. For decades, it served as Moscow's sharpest blade pressed directly against the throat of Western Europe. Inside this small territory, roughly the size of the American state of Connecticut, Russia has packed an almost unbelievable military force. Iskander ballistic missiles capable of carrying nuclear warheads and reaching targets across all of Central Europe sit ready in their positions. S-400 air defense systems scan the skies. The Russian Baltic Fleet is headquartered there, giving Moscow its only ice-free port on the entire Baltic Sea, and according to the most recent military assessments available, Russia maintains somewhere between 12,000 and 15,000 troops inside Kaliningrad at any given time, supported by the 11th Army Corps, and multiple specialized combat units. For years, Western military planners lost sleep over this place. Kaliningrad was considered the ultimate wild card. In any conflict scenario between NATO and Russia, Kaliningrad's Iskander missiles could strike Warsaw, Berlin, and Stockholm within minutes. Its naval forces could threaten shipping lanes. Its electronic warfare systems could blind aircraft across the entire Baltic region. It was, in the language of military strategy, an anti-access area denial fortress of the highest order, Russia's forward punch into the face of the West. But something has changed. Something has changed so dramatically and so completely that even senior American military commanders are now speaking openly about it. In July 2025, General Christopher Donahue, the commander of United States Army forces in Europe and Africa, stood before cameras and made a statement that would have been unthinkable a decade ago. He said that NATO forces could capture Kaliningrad, this supposedly impregnable Russian fortress, in a time frame that is, and these are his exact words, unheard of. He described the exclave as a narrow strip of land barely 75 kilometers wide, surrounded on all sides by the alliance, and said that NATO's capabilities now allow them to, quote, take that down from the ground faster than ever before in history. Former NATO Supreme Commander General Ben Hodges went even further. He stated publicly that if Russia attacked a NATO member the way it attacked Ukraine, Kaliningrad's military infrastructure would be destroyed within the first hours of conflict. No Kaliningrad, he said. All Russian military sites destroyed. These are not empty words from generals trying to sound tough. These statements reflect a reality that has been building piece by piece, step by step, decision by decision over the past several years, and what has happened to Kaliningrad since 2025 represents one of the most complete strategic encirclements of a military position in modern history, achieved almost entirely without firing a single shot. What NATO and the Baltic nations have done to Kaliningrad is a masterclass in what strategists call gray zone warfare. They have cut its energy, they have severed its logistics, they have blinded its intelligence networks, they have trapped its navy, they have built walls of steel and concrete around its land borders, they have jammed its ability to respond with hybrid warfare of their own. And they have done all of this while Russia was busy bleeding in Ukraine, unable to respond effectively on a second front. The result is that the fearsome sword Putin thrust into the heart of Western Europe has been slowly rusting in its sheath, unable to move, unable to breathe, unable to threaten anyone the way it once did. This is the story of how that happened. This is the story of how NATO caged Putin's most dangerous military outpost, and as you will see, the methods used and the results achieved will have consequences that echo for decades. Every military force on Earth runs on two things above all others: fuel and electricity. Cut those two lifelines, and even the most sophisticated weapons systems in the world become very expensive statues. This is precisely what happened to Kaliningrad, and it happened in a sequence of events so precisely timed that it is difficult to believe it was anything other than a coordinated strategic campaign. The first and most historic blow came on February 8, 2025. At exactly 9:09 in the morning, coordinated across all three countries simultaneously, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania executed a synchronized withdrawal from the electricity grid they had shared with Russia and Belarus since the Soviet era. The grid was called BREL, an acronym for Belarus, Russia, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. For decades, electricity had flowed through this interconnected system, and Kaliningrad had been one of the major beneficiaries of that shared infrastructure. In a single technical procedure, each Baltic country sequentially disconnected its remaining transmission links with Russia. Lithuania went first, then Latvia, then Estonia. The entire process was completed in a matter of hours. The significance of this moment cannot be overstated. Kaliningrad was suddenly, instantly transformed into what energy engineers call an energy island. It was cut off from the unified electricity system of the Russian Federation and cast adrift in the middle of NATO-controlled Europe for 24 full hours following the disconnection. The Baltic power systems operated in what technicians called island operation mode, running entirely on their own generation capacity while engineers tested frequency stability and system resilience. The following day, February 9th, at exactly 14:05 in the afternoon, the Baltic states completed their synchronization with the continental European electricity grid, joining the Western power system permanently, while Kaliningrad was left to fend for itself. The fallout for Kaliningrad was immediate and severe. The region switched to fully isolated operational mode. Russian Governor Alexei Bisprozvnik tried to reassure the population that three local power plants, the Kaliningrad TPP-2, the Pregolskaya TPP, and the Talahovsk station, could keep the lights on. But the fundamental problem was not whether the power plants could generate enough electricity. The problem was frequency stability and the complete dependence on limited local generation capacity. Without the massive buffer provided by the shared grid, any disruption to one power plant creates system-wide frequency instability that can trigger cascading failures and blackouts. Engineers and grid analysts describe the situation as inherently fragile and vulnerable to collapse under stress conditions. But the electricity disconnection was only one part of a broader energy siege. The fuel situation was arguably even more damaging to Kaliningrad's military capabilities. For years, Lithuanian railways had served as the critical transit corridor for petroleum products flowing from mainland Russia to Kaliningrad in 2024 alone. This transit route carried 371,000 tons of oil through Lithuanian territory. Then, in October 2025, Lithuanian Railways made an announcement that sent shockwaves through Moscow's military planning apparatus. Citing United States sanctions against Russian oil company Lukoil, Lithuanian Railways officially and completely halted the transit of Lukoil petroleum products to Kaliningrad. That year, the railway had already moved 194,000 tons of Lukoil oil through its network. All of it stopped. The military implications were staggering. Without a constant supply of fuel, Kaliningrad's Iskander missile systems cannot be moved from their storage positions to their launch sites. Without fuel, the Baltic fleet vessels sit motionless at their moorings. Without fuel, the S-400 air defense batteries, which require significant fuel for their radar systems, generators, and transport vehicles, lose much of their operational effectiveness. Without fuel, the 12,000 plus soldiers in the region cannot conduct meaningful large-scale military maneuvers. A weapon system without fuel is not a weapon system. It is a piece of machinery waiting to rust. Russia's attempt to compensate for this energy isolation reveals just how desperate the situation truly is. Moscow deployed a floating liquefied natural gas terminal called the Marshal-Vasilevsky to waters near Kaliningrad. The vessel can store more than 90 million cubic meters of gas in its LNG tanks and was intended to give Kaliningrad an alternative supply route that bypassed Lithuanian territory entirely. The plan looked reasonable on paper. In practice, it has proven deeply inadequate. In February 2025, Kaliningrad went 5 consecutive days without receiving gas through the Lithuanian pipeline, relying entirely on the Marshal-Vasilevsky and local storage facilities. The test revealed that the floating terminal's capacity is sufficient under normal peaceful conditions but dangerously insufficient during periods of high demand or adverse weather. The Baltic Sea freezes significantly during winter months. Heavy ice sheets can make navigation by supply tankers extremely hazardous or outright impossible. The Marshal-Vasilevsky itself cannot operate effectively in severe winter conditions without icebreaker support. Meanwhile, Lithuania's gas transit fees for the new agreement signed at the end of 2025 reportedly tripled compared to previous rates, creating an additional financial burden that Moscow must pay every single month just to keep the lights on and the heating running in a territory it supposedly controls. While the energy strangulation was unfolding, something equally dramatic was happening on the ground. The countries surrounding Kaliningrad were not simply watching nervously from behind their borders. They were transforming those borders into something that military engineers have not seen constructed in Europe since the Second World War, and the scale of what is being built is breathtaking. Poland launched the program in May 2024. It is called the Eastern Shield, or in Polish Tarcza. Polish Defense Minister Władysław Kosiniak-Kamysz described it as, quote, the largest operation to strengthen Poland's eastern border, NATO's eastern flank, since 1945. The numbers behind this program are extraordinary. The Polish government allocated 10 billion Polish zlotys, equivalent to approximately $2.5 billion US dollars, to fortify nearly 700 kilometers of borders with Belarus and Russia's Kaliningrad Oblast. The defensive infrastructure being constructed includes anti-tank ditches reaching for meters in depth, reinforced concrete bunkers equipped with the latest surveillance technology, dragon's teeth barriers, minefields, razor wire installations, and a layered surveillance network powered by artificial intelligence that integrates imagery intelligence, signals intelligence, acoustic monitoring, electronic warfare capabilities, and anti-drone technology. By November 2025, satellite imagery confirmed that the first completed segment of Eastern Shield fortifications had appeared near the town of D. in the Mazursky region that directly borders Kaliningrad Oblast. The images showed substantial anti-tank obstacles already in place. German engineering units have joined the construction effort, reflecting the unprecedented level of multilateral commitment to this defensive project. The European Union has designated the Eastern Shield as a flagship security initiative, making Poland eligible to apply for EU funding to support the construction under the bloc's external border defense framework. But Poland was not the only one building. In March 2025, Poland, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania jointly announced something that would have seemed politically impossible just a few years earlier. All four nations simultaneously declared their withdrawal from the Ottawa Convention, the international treaty that prohibits the use, production, stockpiling, and transfer of anti-personnel landmines. Lithuania's defense minister Dovile Kalian confirmed that her country would begin laying minefields along its border with Russia and Belarus, modeled explicitly on Poland's Eastern Shield concept. The Baltic Defense Line, a trilateral agreement signed in Riga in 2024, connecting Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia in a coordinated defensive infrastructure project, is designed to link directly with Poland's Eastern Shield, creating one continuous fortification running from the Baltic Sea all the way through the eastern frontier. The intelligence dimension of this siege is equally significant. For years, Russia operated what appeared to be consulates and diplomatic facilities in Polish cities, but which were in reality functioning as sophisticated intelligence collection stations. The Russian consulate in the Polish port city of Gdansk was, according to Polish security officials, effectively a signals intelligence center. The massive antenna arrays on its roof were monitoring NATO naval vessels transiting the Baltic Sea, intercepting military communications, and transmitting the collected data in real time to Kaliningrad. Similar facilities operated in Poznan and Krakow. Poland sealed all of them. With those eyes closed, Kaliningrad's garrison lost its ability to monitor military movements across a vast stretch of western Poland. They became strategically blind to activity that was previously transparent to them. Germany's contribution to the ground-level military transformation of the region is historically unprecedented. For the first time since the Second World War, Germany has committed to a permanent military deployment in a foreign country, sending 5,000 troops and Leopard to tanks to Lithuania on a permanent basis. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz and Defense Minister Boris Pistorius attended the inauguration ceremony alongside Lithuanian President Gitanas Nausėda in Vilnius. Merz stated plainly that peace in Europe had been broken. The brigade is being built toward full operational capability by 2027. That means German tanks, German soldiers, and German air defense systems will be permanently positioned between Kaliningrad and Belarus, directly blocking the territory that military planners call the Suwalki Gap. The Suwalki Gap is a narrow corridor, barely 42.65 kilometers wide, running along the Poland-Lithuania border. It represents the only land connection between Kaliningrad and Russia's ally Belarus. For years, Western military analysts identified this corridor as NATO's single most dangerous vulnerability. If Russia and Belarus could seize the Suwalki Gap in a rapid surprise attack, they would physically separate the three Baltic states from the rest of NATO, cutting off land reinforcement routes and potentially allowing a fait accompli takeover before the alliance could respond. That scenario was once considered alarmingly plausible. Today, with permanent German brigades, Polish Eastern Shield fortifications, and minefields being constructed across the region, thus commanders speak of the Suwalki Gap with considerably more confidence. General Donahue and his colleagues have made clear that NATO's forward defenses now aim to prevent any territorial loss in this corridor from the opening moments of any hypothetical conflict. If the land and energy sieges are visible and measurable, what has happened to Kaliningrad on the sea and in the electromagnetic spectrum is equally devastating and perhaps even more strategically significant. Russia's Baltic Fleet was supposed to be Kaliningrad's ultimate trump card. If land routes were blocked, warships and supply vessels could still move supplies, soldiers, and ammunition. If NATO threatened from the east, Kaliningrad's naval assets could project power across the Baltic. That logic has completely collapsed. The transformation of the Baltic Sea into what military analysts now openly call a NATO lake began accelerating with two historic decisions. Finland joined NATO in April 2023. Sweden followed in March 2024. With those two additions, every single country bordering the Baltic Sea became a NATO member except Russia. Itself, 8 out of 9 Baltic Sea nations now share alliance membership, coordinated defense infrastructure, and integrated military planning. The strategic implications for Russia's Baltic fleet are catastrophic. Sweden's island of Gotland, sitting directly in the heart of the Baltic Sea, approximately 250 kilometers from Kaliningrad's coastline, has become arguably the single most strategically important piece of real estate in the entire region. During the Cold War, Gotland hosted 25,000 soldiers and served as a critical control point over Baltic Sea traffic. Sweden demilitarized it in 2005. After Russia's 2014 seizure of Crimea, Sweden began rearming it. After Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the remilitarization accelerated dramatically. Sweden allocated 1.6 billion Swedish kroners, approximately 163 million US dollars, specifically for military infrastructure improvements on the island. Anti-ship missile systems, radar arrays, and layered air defense capabilities are being deployed there. By dominating Gotland, NATO effectively controls all maritime traffic in the central Baltic, including every vessel attempting to move to or from Kaliningrad. NATO's Operation Baltic Sentinel, launched in January 2025 following damage to underwater energy and communications cables on the Baltic Sea floor, added another layer of maritime control. The operation involves coordinated naval patrols, mine countermeasure vessels, and surveillance activities across the entire Baltic region. Russia's Deputy Foreign Minister Alexander Grushko protested loudly in public statements, claiming the operation was aimed at controlling international transport routes and restricting cargo flows to harm Russian interests. His complaints were largely ignored. By April 2026, Russia was publicly claiming that NATO exercises included scenarios for a full naval blockade and military seizure of Kaliningrad itself. The Joint Expeditionary Force, a UK-led coalition of 10 northern European nations, including Denmark, Finland, Estonia, Iceland, Latvia, Lithuania, the Netherlands, Sweden, and Norway, was specifically named as practicing Kaliningrad isolation scenarios. In May 2026, the massive Aurora 26 military exercise was conducted at Swedish training grounds and on Gotland itself. The exercise involved approximately 18,000 troops from Sweden and 11 NATO allies, including the United States, Canada, Britain, France, the Netherlands, Germany, Denmark, Norway, Finland, Estonia, and Latvia. Ukraine participated under the JEF-Ukraine Partnership Framework. The exercise included training on FPV drones, reconnaissance UAVs, and anti-drone systems, precisely the types of capabilities that would be used in any operation targeting Kaliningrad's coastline or naval assets. Against this overwhelming maritime encirclement, Russia has turned increasingly to hybrid warfare tactics emanating from Kaliningrad itself. The GPS jamming campaign is the most documented and most dangerous of these efforts. Researchers from Gdynia Maritime University, working alongside colleagues from the German Aerospace Center and the University of Colorado, have precisely pinpointed the sources of the jamming signals disrupting navigation across the entire Baltic region. Their triangulation identified 2 specific locations within Kaliningrad with approximately 1-kilometer precision. One is the Okunevo antenna site on the central Kaliningrad coast. The other is the Baltiysk area, home to major Russian naval and electronic warfare facilities. These locations host systems including the Murmansk BN, a massive electronic warfare platform with 32-meter-high antennas capable of disrupting GPS signals at distances of up to 8,000 kilometers. The consequences of this jamming campaign have been severe for civilian aviation and maritime traffic. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen's own aircraft was forced to make an emergency landing in Bulgaria in September 2025 after GPS jamming disrupted its navigation systems, a military aircraft carrying Spain's Defense Minister Margarita Robles experienced a GPS attack over Kaliningrad during the same month while traveling to visit Spanish military personnel in Lithuania. Finnair suspended all flights to Estonia for over a month due to navigational safety concerns. Pilots across Poland, Finland, Sweden, and the Baltic states routinely lost satellite navigation mid-flight. The Norwegian Communications Authority recorded 44 days of GPS disturbances in 2024 alone, approaching near daily occurrences. The European Union's response was to sanction the specific Russian military unit responsible, the 841st Separate Electronic Warfare Center based in Kaliningrad, targeting its senior officials by name. NATO issued an explicit warning that if Russian GPS jamming caused a civilian aircraft crash or mass casualties, the alliance would treat it as a deliberate act of aggression, potentially triggering a military response against Kaliningrad's electronic warfare installations directly. Russia, it seems, is aware of exactly how close to the line it is walking. There is one final dimension to Kaliningrad's story that receives far less attention than the military standoff and the energy battles, but which may ultimately prove more consequential than all the weapons systems and fortifications combined. It is what is happening inside Kaliningrad to the people who actually live there, and from Putin's perspective, it represents the most terrifying threat of all. Kaliningrad's civilian economy has been experiencing a slow but accelerating collapse since the escalation of Russia's war in Ukraine. The EU sanctions that restricted transit of coal, metals, wood, cement, fertilizers, cars, and advanced technology products through Lithuanian territory affected between 40 and 50% of all cargo that Kaliningrad imports from and exports to mainland Russia. International insurance companies have classified the region as a war zone risk category and are refusing to insure transport trucks operating in the area. Critical border crossings with Poland have been concreted over entirely. The remaining crossing points have waiting times of up to 12 hours. Latvia has banned all bus services to Russia, eliminating the civilian land route connecting via Riga to Kaliningrad entirely. The last civilian land connection to Europe through the Baltic states has effectively ceased to exist for ordinary people. An AFP report from November 2025 documented the mood on the ground in Kaliningrad. The report described a population putting on a brave face while confronting the economic reality of complete isolation from their EU neighbors and physical separation from mainland Russia. Factory workers tried to project confidence. Local officials insisted everything was manageable, but the underlying numbers told a different story. Supply chain disruptions were cascading through the regional economy. Small businesses that depended on EU trade were shuttering. Consumer goods that once flowed freely across the borders had become scarce or prohibitively expensive. The floating LNG terminal that was supposed to solve the energy problem was proving costly and unreliable. The frequency instability in the electricity grid meant businesses could not count on consistent power. But the deeper and more existentially threatening dynamic for Moscow is cultural and psychological. Kaliningrad is not Russia's heartland. It has no Russian historical roots. It was Nigsburg for centuries, one of Europe's great intellectual cities, the birthplace of philosopher Immanuel Kant, a place whose identity was fundamentally European in character. The Soviet Union forcibly resettled the territory with Russian citizens after expelling the German population, but the land itself carries the weight of a different history. The old German architecture survives in places. The street names changed, but the bones of the city beneath them did not. Among Kaliningrad's younger generation, something remarkable is beginning to stir. Analysts who study the region's social dynamics describe a growing sense of what they call the Nigsburg identity, a reconnection with the European heritage of the land itself rather than identification with Moscow's imperial ambitions as isolation. Deepens as economic suffering grows, as the contrast between life inside Kaliningrad's increasingly suffocating borders and the visible prosperity of neighboring EU nations becomes more vivid and undeniable. A quiet question is beginning to circulate among the population. What exactly is this suffering for? What does Moscow offer in return for this blockade, this poverty, this complete disconnection from the wider world? Putin's security services are acutely aware of this phenomenon. In fact, according to geopolitical analysts who follow the Kremlin's internal calculations, this possibility of civilian unrest and internal political instability inside Kaliningrad frightens Russian leadership far more than any NATO military exercise, a military attack. From outside is something the Russian state knows how to respond to. An internal civilian uprising demanding a different political future is a problem that no amount of Iskander missiles can solve, and the harder NATO and the Baltic states squeeze Kaliningrad from outside, the faster those internal questions multiply. What NATO and the Baltic states have achieved with Kaliningrad is something that deserves to be recognized for what it truly is. Without a single act of conventional warfare, without crossing a single border with hostile military force, they have taken Russia's most dangerous European military outpost and transformed it from a sword, pointed at the West's throat, into a cage that contains its own occupants. The Iskander missiles are still there. The S-400 batteries are still operational. The Baltic fleet still floats in the harbor, but the entire military machine is now operating in an environment so constrained, so monitored, so cut off from reliable supplies and operational freedom that its ability to project meaningful offensive power has been fundamentally compromised. The question now is not whether Kaliningrad has been caged. It clearly has. The question is what happens next, because history teaches us that corners do not make rational actors. They make desperate ones, and a desperate nuclear-armed Russia, watching its prized military exclave slowly suffocate while its European neighbors build. Walls and its own population grows restless is a geopolitical variable that demands careful, sober, and continuous attention from every government in the Western world. The sword has been caged, but the hand that holds it has not yet decided what to do with a sword that can no longer cut.